All right, guys, welcome back. This is U.S. Exceptionalism. I'm Mr. Pruitt, and today we're going to talk about imperialism. All right, so just a refresher on what exceptionalism is. Remember that it's this idea that the United States sees itself as special in comparison to other countries, and we see ourselves special thanks to our founding through a revolution, social mobility, our sort of economic system, and the sort of divine providence that God has sort of put us on this path to greatness. Okay, so we're going to look at imperialism. Well, what is imperialism? Oftentimes, the word maybe makes you think of the Roman Empire, or maybe makes you think of Star Wars and the empire from that. They do have correlations, right? There's some central group that's controlling other farther away groups, and that's kind of what happens at the end of the 19th century. So other countries, not just the United States, but namely really the core countries in Europe like England and France and Holland and the United States, begin to be interested in other countries all around the world. Now, why? Well, that's what we're going to look at right here. So the causes for imperialism, first you have economic motives, right? The Industrial Revolution had caused this sort of massive economic snowball. And so now we needed natural resources or raw materials as inputs for these industrial markets, right? Well, there's only limited land, limited factors of production for all you economic guys that you can use. So you needed to go find other places in far off remote areas to get those factors of production or raw materials. Another need for economic motive or reason for an economic motive would be the need for coaling stations. Realize that navies at this point around the world ran on steam powered ships, and so they needed coal to burn in their boilers to produce the steam to move the ship. So, unlike today's Navy that runs on nuclear energy, you would need way off in the Pacific somewhere like Guam or Hawaii, you would need a station where ships could refuel on their way to Asia. The second thing we got there is nationalism. As it says, European nations wanted to demonstrate their power and prestige to the world. Realize that, yet again, following the Industrial Revolution, this sort of modern military era, you had competition between new sort of emerging nations, right? So the United States wanted to flex its muscle and show the world that it was great. England with its large empire at the time was sort of showing the benefits of that, and other nations wanted to catch up to that. A lot of these same problems that we see with imperialism are actually going to be what lead us to the First World War. And so, oftentimes, imperialism is sort of begins at the end of the Industrial Revolution, and then it sort of ends, give or take, around the end of the First World War. All right, next, the balance of power. As we just mentioned, England had created this massive overseas empire. Famous phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, kind of comes from this time period. Um, Other countries needed to keep pace with that. Okay, they needed to check England to make sure that it didn't sort of run away with this burgeoning new economic system and model that the world was going with, because then they would be able to bully everybody, and so they didn't want to do that, or they didn't want to have that happen. Excuse me. So in Europe, it's competition amongst those guys. The United States needs to get involved, so it begins to control parts of the Caribbean, as we'll talk about that here in a second, and gets involved in places like Hawaii and stuff like that. Lastly, what we have here is the white man's burden. This title or cause comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem by the same title that has to deal with America's involvement in the Philippines. What this is about this sort of noble idea that sort of Western civilization, or sort of this white civilization, it's their burden or their job or duty, if you will, to spread civilization to these uncivilized people. Okay, clearly this is a not a very modern way of thinking about this, but that was another factor, and really you can see a lot of the ideas of exceptionalism, besides spreading our economy, being super competitive, but also this idea that we're great and we need to help you out. You can see that as being an underlying theme for that last cause. During the end of the 19th century, one of the most influential documents that sums up the idea of imperialism is Alfred T. Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan is going to firmly support imperialism, and you'll see here with his points of why we should sort of pursue this strong navy to be competitive, yet again, like we saw in the last thing, with European powers, namely England. So first, Mahan starts off by talking about how in peacetime, the government can make choices to either help the Navy or stifle the Navy or whatever. All right. But that the Navy in and of itself is good because it's going to help bring about a stronger economy. And then he goes, secondly, in war, right, uh, by having this strong Navy, you'll have several benefits. And now I'm just going to talk about the four kind of major things he gets into. So economically, he talks about having faraway markets, right? Being able to trade far on the other side of the world, and then having sea lanes protected by your strong navy to allow that trade to occur. Also, he gets into the ideas of having a strong navy as a sort of an industry in itself, and people supplied for that would be good for your economy as well. As I mentioned earlier, the ideas of coaling stations, right? By setting up these stations around the globe, you'd be able to move your navy and yet again protect the sea lanes for your economy. Now, uh, these coaling stations, depending on how large the base would maybe support colonies, as it says right there. And the idea would be that by having colonial holdings in far off places, you'd be able to protect your coaling stations, and you would have people on the other side of the world that would be sympathetic to your cause. So whenever you could support and have a sort of benevolent, uh, good relationship with those folks, that would help sort of as a symbiotic relationship for each. He uses Australia as a good example. And then lastly, the idea there for military strategy. He talks about how having your large, strong navy spread out over the world, where if somebody attacks one part of it, it would not be defeated, right? Your whole navy will not be sort of destroyed. So you'll be able to move the navy to react to certain things around the globe and to back up, you know, parts of your navy that have been destroyed or whatever. Now, this document is going to set the tone for imperialism. Okay, the United States is going to see this and say, hey, Great Britain has this situation. We need to have something similar. We need to have a great navy. Enter, excuse me, Teddy Roosevelt and the Great Fleet, right, the White Fleet, that he sails around, right, to show the world how important the United States is. Now, with Teddy Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary to the Navy and growing tensions in Spanish-controlled Cuba. The Cubans, for several years before this, had been attempting to overthrow the Spanish. Uh, and the United States had really kind of just looked the other way, not wanting to get involved in, yet again, entangling stuff from other countries. And it kind of had a deal with Spain that, hey, we'll kind of look after Cuba as long as you allow us to trade with Cuba and all that sort of stuff. Well, eventually, the yellow journalism, as you've probably talked about or read about, the idea of this sort of sensationalism from newspapers, um, causes a great stir amongst the American people. So, pressure from sort of popular opinion, uh, sort of economic pressure from industrialists wanting yet again more access to Cuban stuff and markets and wanting to make stuff over there. All of this comes to a head when the USS Maine, who had been sent to the Havana harbor by the president to watch over American interests, explodes. It's under sort of dubious circumstances. You might read about this or do a project with this. But the story is that it hit a mine. More than likely, it didn't hit a mine, and there was an explosion on board, which caused the magazines to explode, which caused the whole ship to explode. You can see up here in the top left image of this sort of brute, right? That was the kind of the popular idea at the time, that the Spanish were these sort of brutish people that had killed the sailors of the Maine. Also, yet again, this ties into this sort of idea of Cuba and all this sort of stuff being kind of backwards, and the sort of darker people not being sort of white Americans and all that sort of stuff. Yet again, tying into that imperialism idea. Now, with the explosion of the Maine, this leads to the United States becoming involved in the Spanish-American War. There's some wonderful stories surrounding the Spanish-American War. We don't have time for them. I'm sure you'll hear about the Rough Riders and San Juan Hill and all that sort of stuff. The bottom image here, you can see the soldiers in their blue uniforms charging up the hill, and the Gatling guns, all that sort of stuff. Now, this war was fought in Cuba, in the Caribbean, and then on the other side of the world in the Pacific, in the Philippines. The Philippine War, as part of the Spanish-American War and all that sort of stuff, will be drastically different. Okay, it will be guerrilla fighting, all sorts of stuff, as we'll see. Now, in 1898, Spain and the United States get together in Paris and form another Treaty of Paris. This one cedes control of all the Spanish sort of overseas possessions like this. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines now are part of a United States empire, if you will. Now, there's going to be questions and debates about, do these guys, are they independent? Can they join the United States? Are they going to be provinces? Whatever. And you'll see some of that coming up here in a minute. But the United States has now gone from being a sort of continental country, right, to having overseas holdings. And so in a second here, go back and look on the previous two slides at a cartoon. If you go look at the cartoon on the top, it has Uncle Sam getting effectively larger and larger and larger. The last sort of fat Uncle Sam is from 1899, following the Treaty of Paris. And then the hands there are all the European powers that now want to do business with Uncle Sam because of his sort of new place in the world, right? But each one of those steps, yet again, Uncle Sam gets larger, and the United States was getting larger. The hands I find interesting. The red sleeved hand is England, right? It's supposed to be like the redcoats, I guess. And then the gloved hand is Germany. And then at the very bottom, you see China with the sort of long, sort of drapey clothes, and then the fingernails. I find that to be bizarre, but nonetheless, that's what this cartoon is about. In 1898, Congress passes the Teller Amendment. It's an amendment to a joint resolution by the U.S. Congress that said that the United States cannot annex Cuba, and that we would respect its sort of independence on some level there. Now, this is yet again the sort of counterpoint to the imperialistic sort of nature of everything. We sort of stop from going all the way, say, like England does, and creating colonies and stuff like that. So the reason I say sort of its independence is in 1901 they also passed the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is going to outline the U.S.'s role in Cuba and in the Caribbean. It's going to establish the boundaries for Cuba. It's going to force Cuba to sell us land for coaling stations and a naval base, which becomes Guantanamo Bay. And also, it'll have provisions in there that won't allow Cuba to sort of to make its own foreign policy or sort of economic policy. And so if they try to pass anything, it has to get approved by the United States, which yet again undermines this whole idea of sovereignty. But yet again, this was the idea of imperialism, right? You had bigger players that sort of dictated what happened to smaller players. And so that's what occurs in Cuba, and we'll see kind of a brief rundown of more of these here in a second. So sort of on the back there of the Platt Amendment, uh, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes the president, he actually sort of legitimizes that whole thing and expands it, I guess, right? So you had the Monroe Doctrine from James Monroe way back in the day, right? The idea that Europe would stay out of the Western Hemisphere, all that sort of stuff. But now you have Teddy Roosevelt making the Roosevelt corollary, excuse me. And the Roosevelt corollary basically states that the United States will intervene in conflicts that involve Europe and Latin America. So, namely, instead of saying the Western Hemisphere is closed, we're going to police the Latin America. We're not going to let Europe come in and, namely, collect debts or have all these problems with Latin America. It all stems from the Venezuela crisis of 1902 and 1903. But if it makes sense for you when you look at imperialism, is this idea is we're going to add all this stuff and we have influence out there, and we have holdings out there that we don't want to have Europe involved in that. We want to be able to police that ourselves. So it really just extends yet again the idea that the United States needs overseas holding and control those overseas holdings. Now, some of the events that occur and sort of effects here of imperialism, and I'm not going to go; these aren't really in order, but in 1899, you have the Boxer Rebellion in China. Uh, Realized that thanks to the open door policy and all that sort of stuff, China had been sort of divided up. All right, it had a black eye from the Opium Wars from England, and was sort of um, opened up to Western influence. Western influence and trade began to dominate and corrupt society in some people's eyes, and eventually there was an uprising. Okay, so you had sort of social upheaval in these places now that were beginning to be marginalized by imperialism. In the late 1800s, also you have the annexation of Hawaii. Right, Hawaii yet again was going to be just a coaling station, all that sort of stuff. But eventually, you get more and more U.S. Investment in Hawaii, and eventually, the same thing that happened in the United States, where planters, say in Virginia or whatever, began to dominate society. Well, the planter class for sugar and maybe pineapples and coffee and stuff like that in Hawaii began to dominate society. And who made up that planter class? Mostly white Americans, not native indigenous Hawaiians. The native, or not the natives, but the Americans wanted to become part of the United States. And really, the big question became over taxes on sugar. The planters were getting a good deal on the sale of their sugar in the United States because they didn't have to pay an import duty. And so what happens is eventually they repeal those import duties with this new tariff and a new economic system. And what they did is they subsidized sugar production in the United States. So if you grew sugar, like say in Louisiana, um, you would get you'd get money from the government. So when this happened, the guys in Hawaii in the planter class did not have their sort of beneficial uh, trade trade status, I guess would be a good way to think of it. So they needed to become a state so they could get that subsidy, right? Um, they effectively overthrow the government with the help of some U.S. Marines. Grover Cleveland actually sends a investigation committee to figure out this dealings and finds that yes, that they were wrongfully overthrown, and is going to allow them to sort of go back to being independent. But around this time, McKinley gets elected. McKinley wants Hawaii, and so you can see here in the cartoon, McKinley is the preacher marrying the Hawaiian there to Uncle Sam or the United States. Also during this time period, you get the completion of the Panama Canal. I know it just says Panama there, but it should say Panama Canal in 1914. Remember, Panama had been part of Colombia at one point, or a part of their area, and the French had started this canal. Um, Teddy Roosevelt and these guys actually, quote unquote, aid a rebellion in Panama to allow the United States to get favorable status with Panama and purchase the canal zone where it was built. In 1910, right before the outset of World War I, you'll have Woodrow Wilson and his interfering in sort of Mexican politics with their revolution, which leads to Pancho Villa and all that sort of stuff. Yet again, with it and, say, Cuba, this just goes to show you how the United States went from being somewhat isolationist, somewhat of a introvert, if you will, with their foreign policy, to now being very active and very concerned with adding more and more land um, to the United States for these imperialistic reasons. Yet again, with this undertone that, hey, we're good, we want to spread that to people. But as we'll see here in Cuba and in the Philippines, it's not like they provide them with the same rights and duties that a person in the United States would have, right? The idea is going to be that Cuba wants to be free, but they're forced to live under the Platt Amendment. And then in the Philippines in 1899, we're going to see how their independence comes about. So the first Philippine Commission is going to be set up in 1899 by President McKinley. And the idea is how to transition the Philippines to being its own country, right? It had been under the yoke of Spain for a long time, and now the United States had control of it. There were debates on to make it a state, to not make it a state, to give it sovereignty, to control it, sort of like we're doing with Cuba, all that sort of stuff. Well, eventually it switches to this idea of not when is the Philippines going to be, or not if the Philippines is going to be independent, but when. All right, you get a second Philippine Commission, and eventually you get all the way to 1916, so roughly 17 years later, the Jones Act passed that basically says that the Philippines, once it sort of reaches these steps, sort of like adding states and stuff like that, it'll be allowed to be self-governed. And so in 1934, there was now a timeline for 10 years down the road, the Philippines would be independent of the United States. The only thing is during their World War II happens, the Japanese take it over. So it's not until 1946 that the Philippines are completely independent, right? So yet again, if you look at this through the ideas of American exceptionalism, you would think that, 1899, we've liberated the Philippines, we'd kind of let them go on their way, but that wasn't the case, right? There was going to be U.S. economic reasons that are going to keep us there and keep us interested in the Philippines and what they do. So it's not going to be for 47 years until the Philippines are actually truly independent. Now, what are some of the pros and cons of imperialism? I mean, there's not a ton of pros, unless you look at it from a Western aspect, the idea that we get those natural resources, we get those coaling stations, that kind of idea. For the people themselves in these new countries, they might get access to newer technologies, better healthcare, better education, that sort of stuff. So that might be your pro, that might be your exceptional sort of push for these things. Um, you know, Yet again, the ideas of missionary work, stuff like that. There's far more negative effects, though. Oftentimes these places lacked independence. A lot of these places had sort of political problems once the imperialistic sort of things stopped. Um, they were forced to sort of produce only what uh, the mother country or what was needed, natural resources wise, all that sort of stuff. So in the end, it's going to cause resentment and sort of political issues as well. If you take a look at the map up here, you can see that here in about 1900, uh, all the different places that were controlled, right? So the green is probably the most interesting, because that's Britain. You can see how they have Canada and South Africa and Egypt and India and Australia and other islands around there that you can't really tell. But this was the world in 1900. It was a checkerboard of things controlled by European powers in the United States. So this is the end for the lecture. Make sure you read the stuff in your textbook to get a better sort of fuller view of this and what to pay attention in class to whatever you do, because this is just one piece of the puzzle for you to get a good idea of imperialism. Also, as it says right there, thesis work. Begin thinking of a thesis for what impact did imperialism have on the United States? How did imperialism affect the United States, maybe politically, economically, right, socially? Those kind of core ideas that we talk about in the history class.